Okay, welcome everybody. It's 6 o'clock and we're here at the beginning of week 3 of Rewriting Skyscraper History. I hope you had a chance to hear some of the other talks that we have now included on our website in the landing page for the entire series. And if you go there, you'll find the links to the videos that record each of the speakers' lectures in advance. Of course, now the ones that are over are on the website with the additional discussion and dialogue that we developed in this hour session that we're going to initiate now with Gail Fenske and Kathryn Holliday, Kate Holliday. And you've, I hope, read the missives that we sent out as reminders for the event in advance that tell you that both Gail and Kate's talks have been pre-recorded and they're on a video on our website. We also, in advance of each of these Monday and Wednesday programs, are playing the 30 or 40-minute talk of each speaker in the hour before the webinar. So I hope some of you have been able to listen to that just now and have Gail's wonderful talk fresh in your minds. You'll be able to watch Kate anytime on our website, and you'll be able to rewatch or catch up with Gail's lecture on our website as well. So if you go to that landing page, which you find through our website, skyscraper.org, through the series Rewriting Skyscraper History, you'll have access to all the past lectures and the future ones. So what we learned about Zoom calls and GoToMeeting platform that we're using over some terrible early experiences, but increasingly it's become clear to us that you really can't mess with this platform very much, that it works well to capture our faces right here, and it doesn't work well at all with videos, except ones that are made in the platform itself. So this is why we, for practical reasons and technical reasons, have developed this flipped lecture series or format that seems to work very well in colleges, universities, where the remote learning happens with professors giving their lectures, you know, making their statements in advance, where students can watch them at their leisure, and then to come together in the classroom online in order to really make good use of the time to have a discussion about the ideas that have been presented. So that's the format that works best for this particular technology, but also has now, really for the first time in Skyscraper Museum program history, allowed us to have enough time to really dig our teeth into some of the issues that are raised. So what we're doing now, and for the rest of this 55 minutes or so, is to have a dialogue, especially between Gail Fenske and Kate Holliday, based on, well, their talks that they put together, which addressed the questions that I framed in the broader context of the Rewriting Skyscraper History thematic for the entire semester. And so one of those themes is corporate versus commercial. We have 2 nights to discuss this, and if you've seen Gail's lecture, you know that she has talked about, well, her special skyscraper, the one that she's the world's expert on, the Woolworth building, and for which she was a curator of the Centennial exhibition that we did here at the museum on the Woolworth building, on the client, on the architect Cass Gilbert, and in the kind of the civic presence and identity of the building in New York. And it's that perspective on the kind of urban milieu, as well as the spectacle of skyscrapers, as well as all of the nuts and bolts of the construction process and the terracotta facades and the glorious lobby mosaics and everything about the wonder of that building. But as a perspective on skyscraper history, I think Gail belongs to a kind of generation of a kind of key generation now of scholars who looked at the skyscraper in the context of the city as a spectacle, as a kind of in a world of consumers and consumption. And though she looks at it broadly in every experience, I think there is a kind of generational focus on this idea that also aligns with the idea of the corporate projection of image that we think of, especially in the post-war skyscrapers. So one of the things about rewriting skyscraper history from the perspective of the 21st century looking backward is to ask some questions that I think weren't asked very much at the times that, let's say, Gail and I went to graduate school, and Kate's a slightly younger generation, and so she has a series of experiences too that have colored the lenses through which she sees the skyscraper. And so in addition to asking Gail tonight to kind of summarize her talk very briefly, and for Kate to respond to these ideas that Gail has presented and the broader ideas of scholarship about the skyscraper, we want also to talk a little bit about historiography, the writing about the history of the skyscraper. And we have Gail's recent experience of a really extremely detailed and almost, I think, heroic would be the right word to describe a bibliography that she's done of writings on the skyscraper by critics, by scholars, by historians, by architects, by builders, from many perspectives. And I asked, this was done in a series for the Oxford University Press that does a digital kind of encyclopedia of bibliographies on various topics. So Gail undertook this Herculean task in order to summarize skyscraper history in a series of themes according to, and looking for thematics in generations of interest about the skyscraper, kind of predominant interest about the history of the skyscraper. So, so this is kind of a two-part evening where the dialogue in particular between Gail and Kate, and I'll insert some questions as well, and we might even have some slides later, but we're going to start talking and find out how much our gesticulations keep you interested. So I'm going to ask Gail to summarize briefly her talk, and then Kate to talk about some of the ideas that she knows from her work. And gee, I haven't really given you all of the kind of glorious bylines or biography of each one of them. Both professors, Gail at Roger Williams University, where she teaches history of architecture and art, and she herself is an architect and has practiced as an architect. She is teaching in person during the semester, which is something that makes this all flawed, I hope, but you know, all a little bit anxious as well. And Kate is a professor at the School of Architecture at the University of Texas at Arlington. And there she teaches all kinds of studios and history courses. And her background is also in art history, but she took a kind of tangent of an architect / engineer in her dissertation on Cyrus Eidlitz. And then in pursuing that topic, and the subtitle of the book on Eidlitz, who is also a theoretician, is Architecture and Idealism in the Gilded Age. The legacy firm of the Eidlitzes turned into eventually the firm that we know so well in New York from the 1920s and 30s, of which Ralph Walker was the key designer. So Voorhees, Gmelin, and Walker. There were lots of partners and lots of permutations of the firm's name, but there's a through line in Kate's work in this firm's legacy firm, but also in its history and its archive of a firm that was particularly commissioned by technology firms. And it's in this work, in their work or through their work for the Bell Telephone Company, so the telephone company as it's invented by Alexander Graham Bell, that she began to pursue an inquiry into the typology, of which is very distinct, of telephone buildings. And she has been at work on a book called Telephone City that she makes reference to in her talk, and we'll ask her to talk more about as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Gail to talk a little bit about your perspective on this topic of corporate versus commercial.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you for that very interesting introduction. Can you hear me? Does the sound working? Oh, good, good. And before I get started, I just want to say I was fascinated by Kate Holliday's talk in its own right, but also it struck me as really pointing out the distinction between corporate initiatives in building these skyscrapers. You know, the telephone companies have a completely different agenda than the group of companies I've examined during my talk and some of my research. And the other thing I wanted to point out is I think it's interesting to think about New York's visual culture, and New York is an environment for tourists and also locals as well, who are dazzled by this new construction in many ways. I mean, not only is it the construction itself and the new idea of verticality, but also we have an environment that's very rich visually. There is a lot happening in terms of the news media, and we see the emergence of this wonderful thing, the color postcard by the late 90s. The earliest skylines I've seen in color were on postcards circa 1900. So there's a lot happening visually, and what I found in looking at the corporate builders of these skyscrapers is that they are really seeing, you know, the speculative skyscraper as a tool for orchestrating perceptions of the urban environment. They know that it's visually very interesting. It's very striking. It's something that catches people's attention. And so they're playing into and orchestrating the visual culture around the skyscraper in a very very interesting ways. And there's a number of dimensions to this. And so my talk began with a look at the New York skyline, Schuyler calling it a tiara of proud towers, and referencing the corporate headquarters of the nation, which was a word that appeared in the Century. It was a term, a phrase in Century magazine in 1883, but was pretty much accepted by 1900. And then later historians viewed the New York skyline, you know, that wonderful skyline of circa 1915, just before World War I, where you see the towers, you see the Woolworth Tower, you see the Singer, you know, along with Bankers Trust and others. And they equated that skyline with the corporation's emergence to prominence on the American scene, and the words corporate skyline were used to describe that. And I know Carol mentioned that in her book, Form Follows Finance, and it's not, you know, she had suggested it's not all that simple. And I'm exploring that here in this talk and in my own interests a little bit further. But what you see is that, you know, I noticed it, first of all, with the Woolworth building, is that these corporations are just not using the space, the ones I am looking at, the ones that are most prominently asserting themselves. They're not using that space that they're financing and building, although they know that space is a very valuable commodity. They know exactly what they're selling to or that they're renting out, and these rents become a way of financing this very spectacular construction. So I began my talk looking at that skyline, and then I pointed out that, you know, the Woolworth building by 1913 at its completion sort of concluded and climaxed a kind of construction that began as early as the 1870s with the first skyscrapers. And I started with the Tribune, and Lee Gray had made an interesting point, many interesting points about the Tribune as a newspaper building, but he said right off that, you know, it houses 150 offices. These are sandwiched in 6 floors that are just rented out. Between, you know, the few floors, it's 2 or 3 that are needed for the newspaper's operations. You know, so you have printing presses down in the basement. You have their editorial offices and composing offices up in the 8th and 9th stories, and the rest is tenants. And so they've created a very prominent statement architecturally about themselves, and they're doing that in City Hall Park. It's Printing House Square, but that extends into City Hall Park, and they have a great amount of visibility in doing that. And as Lee Gray and also Kate Holliday have pointed out, these bulletin boards by which these newspapers announce the news are it's very important that people can see these, and they attract crowds. And of course, people want to know the latest news immediately, even before the newspaper is sent out. And so we find these buildings that, you know, these builders that know that they have a large crowd in a certain place, a kind of captive audience for this spectacular construction. And the Tribune building was beautiful in its color. It had a proud central tower. So that was an interesting first. And then, of course, one of the Tribune's competitors, major competitors, the World newspaper, and Pulitzer builds the tallest, in a sense, showiest building because he's got a gold dome, he's got a striated masonry. But what he does that's very interesting in this development is that he takes the observatory at the top very seriously. Now, the observatory had been around. People went to the top of Trinity Church or the Tower of the Produce Exchange, but he sees this as a way to engage people with his building. And he brings them up there. There's spectacular views. Reporters describe the 360-degree panoramic views. So that's an exciting development. And from the World, in the talk, I looked briefly at the Park Row building because it was the tallest. It triumphed in height over the World, but it was, for the most part, a speculative skyscraper. So it's a very different kind of building. And it has very low floor-to-floor heights. It's really taking up all the site that it can take. And it's, you know, sort of really exploiting that site for the sake of, you know, it's either syndicate. It's not a particular company, not a particular newspaper. You know, the identity is simply a group of speculators. And then I moved to the Flatiron because the Flatiron, in my view, kind of shifts people's interest to the Midtown. And that is, the Flatiron is higher than the World. It's like 309, 310 feet high. And that does shift this interest to Midtown. And what we see with the Flatiron is a new interest. It's 1901, 1902, in the height of that building. Now, Pulitzer had brought people up to nearly to the top of his building for this 360-degree panorama, but with the Flatiron, we see a wonderful article published I believe it was Putnam's magazine of by Edgar Saltus and with illustrations by Vernon Howe Bailey, spectacular illustrations. A complete totalizing view of the city from the top of this building, where every detail is drawn in, and then there's an accompanying narrative about the Flatiron and the history of New York. But it showed that not only is the Flatiron this new center of interest, but that the panorama from the top is especially intriguing. And sure enough, in 1905, we had omnibuses taking people on the first tours of the city, leaving from the base of the Flatiron. And at this time, too, tourism is intensifying in New York. We have up to 200,000 people coming a day into the city. They're coming into the two major railroad stations. They're staying in major hotels, Waldorf Astoria and the Astor, and Park Plaza. So there's this great interest in New York on the part of tourists that's really taken off right around 1900, according to Neil Harris, and I think he's, you know, he explains this beautifully in his article on urban tourism in New York. And on top of that, we have a proliferation right around 1900 of roof gardens, although they trace their roots back to the 1880s, but we see more of them, these kind of roof garden hideaways. We see mid-air dining clubs, a lot of mid-air dining clubs. You could kind of take your choice of where you wanted to go for lunch, and there's one even for business women. And this is right around 1900, 1905. So there's this enthusiasm and interest and wonder on the part of New Yorkers. I mean, because they're going to the dining clubs as well as tourists. And then we see this explosion of these colorful postcards. By 1905, we've got a beautiful postcard of the Flatiron. So this is a kind of visual culture that is developing along with a kind of fascination with verticality and the experience, the human experience of verticality. And so after that in my talk, I moved to the Singer Tower, and I show how Ernest Bourne, the head of the Singer Company, which is the first international corporation. They have, by 1906, when Bourne builds the tower, they've got offices and they've got showrooms all over the world, even Turkey, China, Russia, Europe, everywhere. A major industrial enterprise, which is international in scope, unquestionably. And Bourne builds this tower, and one story, the 34th floor, he wants for his own office. The rest he's leasing out to tenants. So the tower itself becomes a speculative enterprise. They have offices in a block, an expansive, sort of blocky modern French designed by Ernest Flagg structure. And the tower is distinctive. It's a distinctive image. It's a memorable tower on the skyline. And soon enough, we see the Singer Company with their public relations department and press agents promoting it with postcards. They even have a kind of trade card. They're among the first to really think carefully about how they're illuminating that skyscraper at night. They have searchlights at a distance. They've got little pinpoints of light on the tower. And so they're making it a kind of exciting, kind of an extravaganza for visitors, and especially for tourists. They see most of their visitors to the tower as tourists. As tourists would enter a lobby, they see the Singer logo in bronze on top of marble encased columns. They take an elevator, high-speed elevator to the 34th story, and they have a panoramic view. So for Singer, this was a way, not unlike what we saw with Pulitzer, of really bringing people into the tower, the skyscraper that is their headquarters, and engaging people with it, engaging with people with the view, and all the while exposing them to the trademark of the company, which is this giant S, kind of as a logo. And they also have something to take with them that has the trademark. So the trademark is playing into the presentation of this tower, which in itself on the skyline is functioning as a trademark. And then I looked closely at Metropolitan Life, and the Metropolitan Life Insurance Tower, which Roberta Moudry has explained quite well, but it is also promoted, as a landmark, and it also is occupied nearly completely by tenants. As the vice president of the company said, it didn't cost Metropolitan Life a cent because the tenants footed the bill, and he saw it as excellent, advertising. I mean, it totally fulfilled its function as advertising. But what they're advertising to are their policy holders. So they really want their policy holders to know that Metropolitan Life represents protection, stability, and it's got an honest reputation as an insurance company. It's an ethical company. It survived a recent, famous insurance investigation of 1905, the Armstrong insurance investigation. So, and many of its policyholders are working class and are buying very inexpensive policies. And so this is the main audience. And it's got this tower, a kind of quasi-religious quality. It chimes every quarter hour. There are these chimes in this white Tuckahoe marble clad, copy of the Campanile of Venice. It's got this beacon at night that flashes, every quarter hour with the chimes, and it has this kind of almost a church tower kind of quality about it. It has an observatory, but it's not promoted like the Singers. And I have not seen a single postcard image of the view from the observatory, which I find is interesting. And it wasn't even open all that long. I mean, if you look at what's written about it in guidebooks, it's open at least until 1923, but you don't see much written about it after that.
Gail, can I insert a question here and maybe make a comparison with Kate's work? Of course, since talking about historiography and particular, especially monographic studies of buildings, you mentioned Roberta Moudry, who did the study of the people who worked inside of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, and that's one of the lenses that has been in the last generation brought to skyscrapers. What happens inside of them? How are they used? And You also mentioned Neil Harris, from the University of Chicago, who is a historian of material culture, talked about the Building Lives, a wonderful little book called Building Lives, that talks about the birth and life, hopefully not the death and the demolition of buildings, but all of the things that happen during the course of youth, middle age, old age of buildings, right? So to treat it in this kind of life cycle, but what about its interiors as well as its conception? And because Kate's work has also looked about what goes on inside the building in terms of the use, in the same way that Roberta raises those issues about the gendered spaces of women as clerks and the overseers, the male overseers in the workforce. Kate's work, which everybody will be able to hear in her talk, does raise this issue of which is in direct opposition to what you've described so far, of how the building functions as a complete kind of factory or mechanism towards the purpose of one company rather than this more generic commercial space. So it seems like that's a good segue to let her start talking about that a little bit to preview some of the themes. That's all right.
Sure, yeah, that's okay. Thank you very much. That's fine.
Well, so Carol, I really liked your kind of introductory thought about kind of generational ways of thinking, because I think both your work and Gail's work has been fundamental to letting me have a broader range of questions even ask about skyscrapers. You know, some of the earlier work really did have to do with the aestheticization of skyscrapers and how we understand them as designed objects. And that's great work, and there's nothing wrong with it. But I do think that the more complex questions that you and Gail have both asked about financing and who's paying for them and why they're paying for them and how they're successful and who's using them and who the audience is really lets us kind of take another step in trying to understand the way that architecture works in a much broader set of circumstances. And I know as I try to actually finish this book that I've been working on for a long time now, it just gets more complicated, I think, right? Like you just have to ask more and more questions as you keep going, because I know in my case, I need to ask questions about the history of a specific technology of telecommunications and switching technology that I didn't touch on too much. That you have to ask questions about gender and about race and the way that the labor force is segregated within a building, especially when you're looking at the telephone company that had thousands of buildings and at one point in its history had more than 1 million employees. It was the largest private employer in the country. And there are these incredibly complex questions about the way that architecture was used to shape workers' relationships with each other, with the technology, that they were really a kind of piece in a system, and the kind of larger way that corporate management kind of engineered the entire system. And so, especially in the case of telephone buildings, I think what I found really interesting about your talk today, Gail, was you connected a lot of dots for me that I don't think I had ever really thought about connecting that way before, about the way that these early tall skyscrapers really depended on novelty above all else. And that novelty could be derived from a number of things, from experience, from height, from kind of technological mastery, from any number of ways of thinking about tall buildings, but the connecting theme seems to be novelty, something that would make the building distinctive and capture public imagination. That for me is incredibly important to also start to think about the historiography and how we've chosen which buildings we tend to focus on the most, because telephone buildings, despite the fact that they're everywhere, tend to not really receive much attention, which is interesting in its own right. And in some ways, because they multiply in every city over and over and over again, they're not novel, right? They just don't have that sense of capturing the public imagination. I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about novelty and the way that the buildings that you're writing about, it's not just a singular novelty, but a kind of repetition of how do you make the next one novel, right? Like, how do you kind of top the last one? You know, what are the ways that that really works, especially in terms of how it's affected the historiography of how we think about skyscrapers.
Can I also add another aspect to the question? What is the value that one derives from the expenditure to be spectacular in some way.
Of course, it's advertising value. I think what we're seeing here, of course, today we know what advertising is, but we have a certain image, and we think of television or something. But at that time, I see these builders just usually using every strategy they can to this end of advertising. And with Singer, they're advertising to the world, and Woolworth is conscious of that too. They have, Singer has international, showrooms and so forth. Woolworth has stores in other countries. And then with Woolworth, he's using the news media. The printed news media at this time was seen, if you have an article in a newspaper, it was seen as a form of advertising. And so he has a director of advertising named Hugh McAdamy. He calls him that. That's a first. Who gets articles about everything about the Woolworth building. So the novelty of the construction, whatever novelty you can find as related to construction, McAdamy's reporting it. And before the building is, even halfway finished, he's proud he's got it in 200 newspapers all over the world. You also see reports on the Woolworth building in every little town across the country that has a Woolworth store. And so what McAdamy is doing is using the printed news media as a way through news to advertise. And so I think this is really what's key here. And then so once you advertise, you're able to draw people to your goods. In case of Woolworth, it's Woolworth's commodities. For Singer, it's these sewing machines, which are both used in industry and for home use. But these are products, and with Metropolitan Life, they're selling a product, this policy. And Carol, I completely understand your point as well as Kate's about the interior workings of these buildings. And what I find fascinating, I found Roberta Moody's work on Metropolitan Life fascinating in that regard. But one other thing I happened to notice as I was just recently looking at what she wrote, and also Derek Holdsworth and I wrote an article ages ago where we discussed the rental patterns of MetLife. They were mixing from the beginning, leasing space to tenants, along with trying to expand their own offices for paperwork as they kept expanding, and then they'd have to buy out leases. It became very, very difficult for them to expand when they are in fact renting to tenants. So you have this kind of mix. But at the same time, you have exactly what you're describing, Carol, a very regulated work environment, with gender segregation, recreation in one place, work in another, and gender segregated recreation, to be sure, as well as dining areas and so forth. What's interesting about the Woolworth is it's just rented out to tenants. And so these issues we're describing, and then I sort of see the Woolworth building as kind of the antithesis of some of what we're seeing in Kate Holliday's work, where the telephone buildings, everything is precisely organized for what use you need to fulfill. I mean, whether it's the switchboards or the telephone equipment or where the wiring is going. I mean, it is so much a building type that is facilitating these telephonic communications, not only from the, there's places in the city, but to neighborhoods as well. And I found this is the first time actually I've discovered this in the scholarship, where you have this building type, and especially on skyscrapers. Not only is it kind of every square inch of space already called for, right? But it also wants to hide in the city. I mean, why? After you write a book on the Woolworth building, you're asking, why does this skyscraper want to hide itself in the city? And really, really interesting. And not only that, the neighborhood telephone, structures or stations, they are also very, very, very quiet and very reserved, and not at all calling any attention to themselves. And to get back to Carol's question, I do think, we've got to ask about advertising. We've got to ask what's being sold. Our commodities being sold, because of course Woolworth stamps his building with his diamond W on all of his commodities. Not all of them, but many of them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting that the telephone company, for that first generation of buildings, it really was trying to just fit in. It just, and I really do trace that to tension about monopoly, as well as the fact that people never liked to pay too much for their telephone service. Even in the 19th century, it was like they wanted to appear like they were being reasonable. in the amount of money they were spending on buildings. And so looking like your typical building was their strategy. And it's also the case that they actually didn't have that much extra money at that point, as much as there was a kind of shift between monopoly and competition and back again. The amount of money that it took for a telephone company to invest in essentially what was infrastructure, because real estate was infrastructure, the building was infrastructure, the wiring was infrastructure, to them it was all the same. The building was just one more piece of infrastructure, and often to the telephone company engineers, the least interesting piece for the infrastructure. You know, they liked a good switchboard, and they liked thinking about how to actually engineer the system of providing telephone service. But the building was, for the internal dialogue, the least interesting thing, and they had to hire an architect. You know, it wasn't necessarily a really great opportunity to advertise the image of the company. And so there is this really radically different attitude within that business. And it's dominated by engineering thinking about the purpose of architecture.
Excuse me, and then all the while they're taking really expensive,
Yes.
you know, real estate in Lower Manhattan.
Yeah, and that was the key. Like every city, the moment when you get your first telephone building in any American city is the moment when you know that they've kind of traveled over the edge of a threshold of how many subscribers they have and how much money the local telephone company has on hand. Because before they hit that threshold, they're not going to buy the land and they're not going to invest in the building. They're going to continue to lease until they have enough capital to actually to justify the investment in what's going to be a really permanent, it's kind of tethered location. And again, that's really different than these lease spaces where companies, you know, if it doesn't make sense anymore, they can just leave. Telephone company is stuck.
Kate, I'm going to tell you there's some kind of glare, like sun glare or something.
There is, yes, the sun is coming down in Texas now. I'm moving a little bit to be out of the sun glare.
Yeah, I don't know. It'll be there for the rest of time, but the temporality of it at the moment is kind of be sure not to go underwater.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes. I might have to sit in a booster chair.
Okay. So well, here's a detailed question about how the telephone company financed their buildings. You're suggesting that it was out of the revenues rather than borrowing money. And when did they become a publicly traded stock company?
So Richard Johns has a really wonderful corporate history, Network Nation, that goes into enormous detail about the back and forth between different models of the national monopoly, the operating companies, how the Bell monopoly kind of came to be across a few decades. And the real answer to that question varies a little bit depending on where you are. The monopoly, as we know it, really doesn't come to be until the 20s. But there's still large pockets of the country where there's telephone competition, and the AT&T system never becomes the actual provider. So in a place like New York and Chicago, those are first because they're able to push out other competing local telephone companies really quickly. And the main thing is, and this is where I need my graphic to try to explain the corporate structure of AT&T, but AT&T is always the national company. And then underneath AT&T, there's long lines that provides long distance service. And then local service is provided by all of the local operating companies. So New York Telephone, New Jersey Telephone, Southwestern Bell, California Bell, Pacific Bell, excuse me, Mountain States, I won't name them all, but there's this very complex system. And the key is that all of those companies, as well as Western Electric, that actually manufacture telephones and switchboards, all of them are owned by AT&T. And even for competing companies like the General Telephone Company that provided telephone service in North Texas, for example, or other, there were lots of regional operating companies that competed in places like Kentucky also. Those places still had to make licensing agreements to hook into the national long distance system. So they're kind of different financial models. And this is the other part of the conversation I think is really interesting in comparison to Gail, where there's like this singular focus for Woolworth on a skyscraper as a kind of a one-off, but this multiplication of stores for the telephone company, in a way, it's opposite. They have this multiplication of buildings across the country, but they want at the same time not to appear to be one national company because of the fears about the image of monopoly. And so they're trying to break down their image rather than build it up into a singular image. And so there's this interesting kind of contrast between the way that those two companies approach what it means to have a national architecture.
Well, that makes me think about another question that seemed to be in contrast to Woolworth or Singer, Bourne and Singer. And well, one of the kind of key, well, let me ask the question in this way. Who was the client, the comparable decision maker to Whitlaw Reid for the Tribune building or for Frank W. Woolworth who selects Cass Gilbert? How did the telephone company, who made those decisions? Was it a corporate decision? Was it a client decision? And this will also, I hope, segue into a short discussion, well, as long as you like, about the biggest cliche about interpreting skyscrapers in the popular imagination is that it's all about ego. That's all it is. It's all about ego. How does that, conform, jive with who are the decision makers with the telephone company, and then maybe also using commercial versus corporate to dispel this idea that it's an irrational, ego-driven impulse to build tall?
Well, probably the telephone company is probably one of the most rational decision makers about buildings because they truly do engineer the system first and then decide how much building they need to cover it up, right? It's an envelope. There's a switchboard conference in 1923 where all of the telephone company engineers get together to talk about what the ideal kind of relationship is between switchboard design and how you would design a building to support them and the most efficient way. Because the telephone company built so many buildings, they were really conscious of construction cost, and everything was about engineering the cost downward of the building as compared to the system itself. And so there were very careful considerations about how much revenue was being generated by subscribers, how much the real estate cost, and how much a building was going to cost before a decision was made. The decision making was happening within the local companies as well, so not at the national level. And that's why you get all of these very long-term relationships between a firm like Cyrus Eidlitz and McKinsey, Voorhees, Gmelin and Walker, all the way to HLW today, where New York Telephone collaborated with that one firm for decades. In Chicago, it's Halliburton and Roach that designs telephone buildings for Chicago Telephone, and then Illinois Bell for decades. You have the same relationship with Southern Bell and an Atlanta-based firm. The same firm will design telephone buildings for generation after generation because they're willing to accept the kind of secondary relationship that they have to the telephone company engineers as the main decision makers.
But why do you think there wasn't an in-house architectural department that would deal with this kind of, problem solving and conformity?
That's a really great question. And I think that part of the answer in what I found is that there were questions about making sure that the telephone company was giving business to local businesses. And this was another way of trying to break down monopoly, is saying that actually we're providing an income flow into your local business. So a New York architect did not design telephone buildings in California and vice versa. And a Chicago architect did not design buildings in Minnesota, right? It was always a local firm because it was going to be local business that was being generated by the building of a new building. I think that's one of the really big factors there.
So Gail, do you want to talk a little bit about ego as the impulse or alleged impulse for skyscrapers?
Yeah, I know. With regard to Woolworths, now it's hard for me to find out too much about Bourne or about Hegeman. Haley Fisk, for instance, I don't know if this is really tied to ego at all, but to character. He was the vice president at MetLife and very influential over the design of the tower. And he was a deeply religious man, it was said, which is interesting. Woolworth, everybody in his circle, people who knew him, you know, the builder, Louis Horowitz and others, you know, said his ego was a thing of extra size and extra size. And if you've got to take this into account when you think about his skyscraper. So people did say this is a person who had this ego. However, I think when we're kind of looking across at all of the construction as related to these very showy towers, from you know, starting with Reed all the way through Woolworth, what we're seeing is just an interesting kind of cast of characters, Joseph Pulitzer included, and certainly I think you know, ego is part of it, but I think also that they have a kind of relatively interesting array of objectives, you know, that we can't just sort of simplify by, oh, they just want to build this big structure. I mean, you know, somebody like a Woolworth, this person is totally embedded in the visual culture of the day. He watches crowds. I mean, he almost scientifically studies the movement of crowds, so that he can take his commodities to the people. And so he knows where the crowds in New York are. You know, they'll be looking at his Woolworth building like a giant signboard as they cross the Brooklyn Bridge and so on. So for me, this is the kind of thing that becomes a little bit more interesting than just, you know, saying it's the ego and then dismiss it. It's something, you know, in historiography, you know, it's akin to me to the corporate skyline, when we just say, oh, well, corporations built a skyline, thus it's a corporate skyline. You know, when we start looking at individual characters and individual actors, and even if it's the professionals, as Kate has mentioned, the engineers, the switchboard engineers, you know, the people involved with the construction of these buildings and the ideas behind their design, it's just such a rich array of individuals, you know, and in the case of Metropolitan Life, I think this man, Haley Fisk, even though he's not the president, I mean, he's still influential. So, you know, it's a much more complex mix of things that I think is more illuminating of the day's culture if we start to look at each individual engaged with these activities, or even in the case of a Woolworth, the single person, kind of the complexity of his thought. It's much more revealing of society and culture, and interesting questions of that moment.
So I should mention at this point that I'm glancing at chat and I don't see any questions. So for people who, it's probably because I haven't invited any yet, but especially because we have less than 15 minutes left for this evening, but we have a whole nother hour on Wednesday. I'm going to invite people to add their chat questions now or send them to the museum at info@skyscraper.org so that we can entertain some of those questions in our next session. Let me ask Gail to do a quick summary of this Oxford University Press bibliography, the process of how you began to think about how to model the problem about all sorts of writing on the skyscraper, and a little bit of the spectrum and the chronology that you found, you know, as periods within this century or so, really, of writing.
Thank you, Carol. This was a fascinating project to work on. The bibliography comes out to about 35 pages, and it's divided chronologically. And it's also divided in terms of kind of the way certain kinds of scholarship or certain scholars consider the skyscraper. So for instance, I have a category, the skyscraper in economic history, the skyscraper in social history, the skyscraper, you know, in art, literature, and film. You know, so there's a number of kind of lenses that people who are interested in the skyscraper bring to bear on it in their study of it. And then, of course, there's the architectural historians, and with, you know, within what we know is architectural history. And I also have a category of urban history. But within that category of architectural history, I've broken down the scholarship by era. You know, starting with the early skyscraper, the 1920s and 30s, post-war skyscraper, 1960s and 70s, and the 1980s to present. But even within the architectural history scholarship, I find that scholars generally look at this building type as part technology, part urban history. You know, even somebody like a Carl Condit is looking at the city of Chicago, and you know, in some ways part art history if we're really looking at the really fine designs. As Kate was speaking, I was thinking of Timothy Pfluger in San Francisco for his Pacific Bell. That is a remarkable building, and I was actually asking myself, how did they justify the expense of that? But we can return to that later. To get to Carol's question, which I think is a very interesting one, you find in the historiography of the skyscraper, the scholarship on it, Carl Condit looms really large in the 50s and 60s, and he is really, you know, I think most people probably listening tonight know this already, but you know that he's really looking for a way or a route for modern architecture. I mean, he sees the skyscraper as a kind of a breakthrough in Chicago as a point where modern architecture began, and you know, in Chicago architects in their focus on structure and the spare quality of their designs were the first modern architects in his thinking, and he substantiated that. But nonetheless, you know, his Chicago School of Architecture is a very interesting book. I mean, he covers many interesting aspects of the technology that we don't necessarily today all agree with. But that was the emphasis. I mean, it was very much a modernist perspective on this building type. And there are others like Condit, but as Carol knows, there was also this debate over the first skyscraper that at that time became really, really critical. Where was the first? Because we have to find the origins of this modern building type. And it was mostly Winston Wiseman who was arguing for New York, J. Carson Webster kind of back and forth between Chicago and New York. Carl Condit supporting Chicago and the home insurance building as the first skyscraper, but later kind of backed off from that. So that kind of continued throughout a good part of the mid-20th century. And it was only later with the interest, what we call postmodernism, but I think more interesting than that, at the Museum of Modern Art, there was a wonderful exhibition on the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And I think then there was a kind of shift in the scholarships to where the New York skyscrapers of the turn of the century, hardly anybody had looked at these. These became interesting again. That, you know, these buildings with these, you know, historical exteriors that have these historical references, it became fascinating for a certain group of scholars. So we have that moment. That's Sarah Bradford Landau and Carl Condit. Their book on the New York skyscraper, I think, is representative of that. And then later in the 90s, we see a kind of very, very different thing, as Carol, you were suggesting earlier, an interest in urban culture. I know, Carol, you wrote Form Follows Finance. I mean, that's really looking at the vernacular in two different cities, but I have to say there's a very precise formal analysis of that vernacular in the positive sense, where you're looking really carefully at the form of those cities as related to financial criteria, you know, to zoning and so on, and it gave us a view of those two cities that we just didn't have before. And so it's important in that it provides a kind of reference for city building in those two cities. And then we saw, you know, Joanna, a little bit later, Joanna Merwood Salisbury kind of looking at labor conflict in Chicago, for instance, you know, the urban environment in Chicago for skyscrapers. And much more interest in clients and in the city. Kate Holliday gets into this as well. I mean, there's a context for these telephone buildings. They're not just buildings that stand alone and have a particular stylistic character, you know. And not only is there an urban context, there's also the interior of these buildings, which, as Roberta Moudry is looking at, you know, office work is factory work, essentially. So I think since the 90s, there's been an expansion of questions around how we look at these, buildings. It's just, and the urban emphasis that Carol mentioned earlier, I think is really central to this. But I think all dimensions of the skyscraper, I think there are many social historians who've illuminated the skyscraper beautifully. So it's just since the very origins of the scholarship, we've seen these shifts in emphasis on the part of historians. And I think Carol mentioned to me earlier, we don't have a history yet of the 21st century skyscraper. Who knows what that will look like, but it'll probably look very, very different from the sort of thing we're discussing tonight.
Well, I hope we're laying the foundations for having some definitions that are a little more expansive than a tall building with a steel skeleton structure, which is the one that is in the Getty Thesaurus today when you look online for keywords. So let me just add about my experience in the 90s, because Foreign Policy Finance was, I think, 1995 was published, and it was an evolution for me to get to the point that I was of my perspective in that book, because I was really coming out of a frustration about stylistic analysis on the one hand, and a really strong historiographic focus that I think at Columbia was one of the kind of controlling ideas in seminars to think about texts, whether it was buildings as texts or the importance of texts in controlling history and theory. And for me, the much more practical issue of the building was what eventually won out against my kind of initial art historical impulse to talk about arguments about style, but then also to validate the American experience of the skyscraper, which was not really considered a kind of bona fide capital A architectural subject for study at the time that I was researching my book. But what there was in art history was this search for an American style. And I think that Kate's work, especially with the buildings in the 1920s, involves architects who had some kind of voice and idea about this, who were working at a time when there was this birth of this undeniable modernism in terms of building form, like the skyscraper or the kind of the mechanics of everyday life. That needed to be played out in the architecture, not as a historical reference to Gothic or, well, the telephone building, AT&T building, did have a kind of wedding cake of classical columns. So those were still struggles in the architectural community at the time. But I think among scholars, I think that in my generation, we were looking for something which was a kind of bona fide American voice that had behind it a real modernist mindset. And the way that played out in the literature in the generation, my generation, and just I think before that, was in the celebration of Louis Sullivan, right? Who is this kind of king figure in the historiography. He's called the father of the skyscraper for rather preposterous reasons, because it was his partner who designed the buildings that got up there tall, and Louis decorated them magnificently, right? And then he had a theory about them, but he belonged to that search for origins, right? So
I think Louis Mumford was a big voice for that.
Say again, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think Louis Mumford was really seeking a particular kind of American, modern architecture, and for him, Sullivan was very important. And by the way, in that bibliography, I have a whole section on Sullivan,
Right.
precisely the reason you've explained. Yeah.
So we have about 2 minutes left, and I think I should leave Kate those minutes to talk about maybe that idea and twist it forward into your teaser for people to watch your talk before they come to our follow-up discussion in 2 days.
Yeah, so I've been reading the Brown Decades recently too, just to kind of go back and think about things, and I think one of the things that kind of has informed my kind of evolution as a scholar is this perspective I was taught as a graduate student, that where we're really interested in expanding the canon, right, and looking past what we had inherited and trying to bring new people, new places, and new ideas into the way that we talked about things. And whether that's as simple as writing about practitioners that we don't know much about and don't know how they fit in, or whether in the case of the kind of telephone building project, it's really just trying to understand how something very mundane and often the talk that we'll talk about on Wednesday, looking at some pretty good buildings and some interesting ways of trying to manage them across time rather than thinking of them as being finished. But they're buildings that are constantly changing and evolving, which is a little bit different than how we sometimes think about buildings. But there are a lot of telephone buildings that are not very pretty and that are not the kind of jewel boxes that we tend to think of, especially they're not as nice as the buildings that Gail talked about today. And I'm really interested in that. Right? We have this incredible proliferation from a kind of singular mindset of hundreds, really thousands of buildings across the country. And where did that idea come from? And I think that fits into this kind of canon expansion still, even though I think we've moved past that initial impulse. That's really where some of that comes from, is to just keep pushing the boundaries of what we consider to be the subject matter of architectural history.
Well, I think I was completely right when I said that we would to have another hour's worth of discussion is going to provide us new territories to explore in just 2 days. So I invite people back to do that. And I'll also kind of insert the idea into this, the binary of commercial and corporate. Is the idea that I'd like to explore in other aspects of our weeks, and that Kate has alluded to, is the idea of typology. That she explores the telephone building as its own distinct typology, and I think the skyscraper is indeed a kind of typology. And I would float this idea that its key characteristic is that it's commercial urban architecture. So I hope that we can explore that a little bit more in 2 days, and also in the weeks to come with our additional speakers. So I guess we're going to say good night for tonight, and thank you so much, Gail and Kate. And
thank you, Carol.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to be here.